the list of teams that have been knocking Celtic out of the Champions League doesn't make for good reading, because it sort of contradicts. We all know that once you get to the Champions League, you might take a sore one off Real Madrid or PSG or Bayern Munich. Of course, that can
Dortmund a
happen.
few years ago,
And we can always, as Scottish teams, complain about the financial discrepancies once we step into that arena. You then, that, if we're talking big picture, it feeds into what Ross Desmond said very infamously now at the AGM that never finished, about his take, that Celtic almost couldn't compete in Europe, and that got fans' backs up, because the list is now Lask, Karat Almaty, Midtjylland, Ferencvaros, Cluj, AK Athens and Astana. Which of them has a budget that blows Celtic out the water? None.
Celtic supporters have been saying it for years. The Celtic board need to be held accountable for the club's lack of ambition in Europe, and now it looks like even the mainstream media are starting to wake up. Because Gordon Duncan was absolutely right to call out Ross Desmond over his comments surrounding Celtic's European ambitions. Let's go back to that infamous Celtic AGM. Ross Desmond stood up and delivered a statement on behalf of himself and his father, Dermot Desmond. And this wasn't some random supporter having a rant. This was the son of Celtic's principal shareholder standing in front of shareholders and defending the way the club is being run. Ross Desmond addressed criticism of Celtic not kicking on in Europe and argued that supporters need to understand the modern financial landscape. He also defended the club's model as one which had served Celtic well for decades. And then came the line that really summed up the attitude of this Celtic board. Ross Desmond said, "We can communicate better, we can recruit better, we can compete better." Well, Gordon Duncan was right to challenge that, because Celtic supporters aren't asking for Celtic to suddenly become Real Madrid. They're not asking Celtic to outspend Manchester City. They're asking why a club with Celtic's resources, support and dominance of Scottish football can't consistently build a team capable of competing at a higher level in Europe. And that's a perfectly legitimate question. In fact, it's a question the Celtic board should be welcoming. Nobody is asking them to throw money around recklessly. But sustainability shouldn't become an excuse for standing still. And being realistic about Celtic's financial limitations shouldn't mean abandoning ambition. Because here's the thing. Celtic don't need to compete financially with the biggest clubs in England. They need to compete intelligently. Look at clubs like Club Brugge. Look at Bodo Glimt. Look at Karabag. Look at the clubs who have repeatedly shown that smart recruitment, proper planning and ambition can take you further than your budget might suggest. So, when Ross Desmond effectively tells supporters that Celtic have to operate within their limitations, Gordon Duncan is perfectly entitled to ask, why aren't those limitations being challenged? And this is where I actually think something positive is happening, because for years Celtic supporters have been making these arguments. We've been saying the board are too comfortable. We've been saying domestic dominance is being used to disguise European stagnation. We've been saying Celtic have the resources to do more. And we've been saying the relationship between the board and the supporters has become completely disconnected. Now we're seeing mainstream broadcasters asking some of the same questions. Gordon Duncan calling this out is important because he's not operating from the Celtic fan media bubble. He's doing it on a mainstream football programme. And that means these questions are reaching an audience far beyond Celtic Twitter, YouTube and fan podcasts. That is a good thing, because perhaps the Celtic board can dismiss supporters as angry. Perhaps they can dismiss fan groups as unreasonable. But when mainstream journalists and broadcasters start asking the same questions, they become much harder to ignore. And let's be clear about something else. Ross Desmond wasn't simply some outsider commenting on Celtic. He was speaking on behalf of his father, Dermot Desmond, one of the club's most powerful shareholders. That makes his comments significant, and that's exactly why Gordon Duncan was right to scrutinise them. Because if the ownership is telling Celtic supporters that the club can compete better, then supporters are perfectly entitled to ask, when? When are we going to see the evidence? When are we going to see the recruitment improve? When are we going to see Celtic build a squad specifically designed to compete in Europe? When are we going to see the club stop treating Champions League qualification as the end goal and start treating European competition as something Celtic should actually be trying to win games in? Because Celtic have spent years dominating Scotland, and that's great. But domestic dominance is supposed to provide the platform for European success. It shouldn't be used as a substitute for it. And this is why I think Gordon Duncan's intervention is actually a positive development. The mainstream media finally appears to be asking questions Celtic supporters have been asking for years. And personally, I welcome it. I don't want Celtic's ownership protected from criticism. I don't want journalists making excuses for them. I don't want supporters being told to know their place. I want the board challenged. I want the strategy questioned. And I want Celtic to be ambitious again.